It was a quiet Thursday morning in Bethesda, Maryland. Officer Frank Anderson was on patrol, half listening to the chatter on the police radio. Frank had been a cop for 15 years, but lately, his badge felt more like a burden than an honor. He'd become infamous in his precinct for his quick judgments, a habit he didn't see as a problem. That day, a sleek black SUV sped past his cruiser. Without hesitation, Frank switched on his siren and pulled the vehicle over. He approached the driver's side. The driver, black man in his mid-40s, rolled down the window and offered a polite, "Good morning, officer." Frank didn't bother returning the greeting. "License and registration," he demanded. He peered into the SUV but didn't look past the driver's seat. The driver handed over his documents. His name was George, a professional chauffeur with over a decade of experience. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" Frank asked, scrutinizing the documents. "No, officer," George replied honestly. "You were speeding," Frank said. "I don't believe I was," George answered politely. This response seemed to irritate Frank. He leaned closer and his tone was turning sharp. "Are you arguing with me?" "No, sir. I'm just saying I've been keeping to the limit." Frank narrowed his eyes, ignoring the driver's calm demeanor. "Step out of the car." George hesitated but complied. As he stepped onto the shoulder of the road, Frank began questioning him aggressively, ignoring the tinted windows and what might be beyond them. Inside the SUV, the passenger in the back seat watched the scene unfold silently. Donald Trump adjusted his seat slightly. He had chosen to ride with George that day to enjoy a quieter trip to his favorite golf course. No media, no motorcade, just him and his driver. But this wasn't the peaceful ride he'd envisioned. Frank was midway through accusing George of having a suspicious attitude when he heard the rear window roll down. He turned, and his eyes widened as Donald Trump's unmistakable face came into view. "Is there a problem here?" Trump asked casually. His tone was light, but his eyes were sharp. Frank froze. The realization of who he had just profiled hit him like a freight train. His mind scrambled for an explanation, but his mouth hung open, unable to form words. "I asked, is there a problem?" Trump repeated, leaning slightly out of the window. No, sir," Frank stammered, stepping back instinctively. "Good," Trump said. "Then maybe you can explain why you pulled over my driver." The officer's confidence evaporated. He mumbled something incoherent, his face flushing red. George stood silently, watching the exchange with a quiet dignity. Trump's expression didn't waver. "Let me make this clear," Trump said firmly. "You just harassed an innocent man who was doing his job. And you did it because you assumed things about him that weren't true. That's not how this works, officer. Not in my America." Frank's hand tightened on his belt, but he said nothing. Trump's words were loud enough to make the passing cars slow down, their drivers craning their necks to see what was happening. "Now," Trump continued, "you're going to let George get back in the car, and you're going to leave us alone. Understand?" Frank nodded stiffly, his pride and authority crumbling under the weight of his mistake. George climbed back into the driver's seat. As the SUV pulled away, Frank stood on the side of the road, humiliated and shaken. Little did he know, his day was about to get much worse. Frank returned to his patrol car, his mind clouded with the embarrassment of what had just happened. He hadn't merely offended a civilian, he had profiled the driver of one of the most influential men in America. He tried to brush it off, telling himself that nothing more would come of it. After all, who could have predicted that Donald Trump, the former president of the United States, would be in the back seat of a random SUV? But by the time he reached the precinct, the news had already started to spread like wildfire. A few of his colleagues avoided eye contact as he walked in, while others exchanged knowing glances. He barely had time to sit at his desk before his commanding officer, Captain Roberts, called him into the office. "Anderson, take a seat," Captain Roberts said curtly. Frank obeyed, his palms sweating. The captain's face was stone cold, the kind of look that promised bad news. "Do you know what you've done today?" Roberts asked, sliding a tablet across the desk. On the screen was a video clip that had already gone viral. Someone driving past had filmed the entire exchange between Frank, George, and Trump. The audio was crystal clear, and Trump's words about harassment were echoing across the internet. Frank's stomach dropped as he watched. "This," Roberts said, pointing to the screen, "is not just a mistake. It's a national disgrace." "Captain, I didn't know he was," Frank began, but Roberts cut him off with a raised hand. "That's the problem, Anderson. It shouldn't matter who he was. You racially profiled a man doing his job, and now the whole world knows about it." Frank tried to explain, but it was useless. The captain handed him a suspension notice. "Turn in your badge and gun. Effective immediately." Frank's protests were ignored. He left the office in a daze, feeling the eyes of every officer in the precinct on him. Meanwhile, at his Mar-a-Lago residence, Donald Trump was on a call with the police commissioner. His tone was calm but resolute. "This isn't about me," Trump said. "It's about the principal. That officer didn't even bother to check who else was in the car before jumping to conclusions. I can't stand for that." The commissioner assured Trump that action would be taken, but Trump wasn't satisfied with vague promises. He decided to take matters into his own hands. The next morning, Trump's legal team filed a formal complaint against Frank Anderson, citing abuse of authority and discrimination. The media picked up the story, fueling national outrage. Frank's suspension quickly escalated into an internal investigation. It didn't take long for other complaints about his behavior to surface. George, now a reluctant public figure, spoke out in a televised interview. "I'm not angry," George said. "I'm just disappointed. People like Officer Anderson make it hard for hardworking individuals like me to do our jobs without fear." His grace under pressure won the hearts of millions, including Trump, who called George personally to commend him for his professionalism. "You handled that better than most people would," Trump told him. "I respect that." As the investigation concluded, Frank was officially terminated from the police force. The precinct issued a public apology, and new training programs were implemented to address racial bias. George, meanwhile, received an outpouring of support. Trump even invited him to a golf game as a gesture of goodwill. And this brings us to the end of this story. Thank you for watching till the end. I hope you enjoyed the story. If you did, don't hesitate to like the video and share it with your friends too. Subscribe to our channel and turn on the notification bell for more fascinating stories. Have a nice day.